Any for your thoughts?
Wrap it up, fuzzball.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to DragonCon Virtual. I appreciate you guys all making time from the comfort of your own living room, or in my case, basement, to take part in this. I genuinely wish that we were all sitting together in the Marriott 706, our home away from home, every Labor Day weekend. But this is the next best thing. We're coming to you with something that I think would be the centerpiece of DragonCon if it were happening in person in Atlanta, and that's a discussion of The Mandalorian, and specifically a discussion of the many, many cultural roots of The Mandalorian and their connections to the real world. We have a really phenomenal group of panelists here who have all pitched in to bring this panel together in short order. And without further ado, I want to go ahead and allow them to introduce themselves. So first up, Brian, please introduce yourself to everyone.
So my name's Brian Young. I write about Star Wars for a lot of different places, including StarWars.com, Star Wars Insider, sci-fi / film fandom, like pretty much anywhere you can read about Star Wars. Chances are I've written something about Star Wars for them. And I do a Star Wars podcast called Full of Sith, and you can find that if you like hearing me talk about Star Wars. But more than anything, I really love DragonCon. I've been going to DragonCon for a long time, and I'm really disappointed I can't be out there in person. But like you said, this is the next best thing, and I'm glad to have even that. I just don't have enough whiskey.
And you do have your Jar Jar tie on, which is a staple of DragonCon.
It is.
It's just not the same. Not looking down to the other end of the panel stage and seeing that live. But oh well, next year. Tom, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure. My name is Tom Hutchins. Most people know me as Mandalore the Uniter. I'm the founder of the Mandalorian Works Costume Club. In my spare time, I build Mandalorian armor. I do a lot of tutorials and weekly live streams to teach people how to build their own Mandalorian armor costumes. I've traveled several different countries around the world, spreading the love of Mandalorians and how to build the costumes. So, it's probably one of my favorite real life things is bringing fans together over Mandalorians. So, this is a unique experience with this virtual DragonCon. I've got about 13 DragonCons under my belt, so this is, I kind of miss seeing everybody that I would normally see there, there at the table. So it's new, but is what it is.
Tom, I miss your costumes most of all, watching you all kitted up. You're like the Jocasta Nu of Mandalorian anything and everything.
Well, it's a little bit lighter this year. I don't have to worry about marching the 2 miles in the parade, right?
That's true, and 100-degree heat, no less. Alexa, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi, I'm Alexa Shipes, and I'm a history major at Oglethorpe University. And I got in Star Wars by watching A New Hope in my 9th grade film studies class. And I basically fell in love with it the first time I saw it.
What's your preferred historical era?
My preferred historical eras are the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and anything to do with Russia.
Outstanding. Well, thank you for joining us. Kyle, introduce yourself, please.
Yep, I am Kyle Bennett, and longtime DragonCon attendee. I've sat in the audience a lot for these great Star Wars panels, and this is my first time actually being on one, so I'm super excited about that. I got into Star Wars because as a little kid, my older sister was a big fan, and she started showing me the movies, and I got really hooked, as you can kind of tell from my background, by all these Star Wars books, which I've read over 100 at this point. Anytime I tell a non-Star Wars fan that, they like their Star Wars books, and there's over 100, so that's always how I proved my Star Wars fandom. But I went to Berry College, and my degree was in political science, and my expertise was always political history. So I've always enjoyed studying various societies and how their cultures developed, and definitely the political systems. So this panel definitely combines probably two of my biggest passions for sure.
If I'm ever in your area at a bookstore and I can't find a Star Wars book that I'm looking for, I know who I'm writing my hate mail to because it's inevitably on your shelf. I'm Thomas Harper. I want to thank you guys all for joining. I'll be at the helm today as your moderator. I've been going to DragonCon for a while now. Actually, I was not going to be able to go to DragonCon this year for the first time since I got back from Afghanistan in 2013. We welcomed our second baby about a month ago, so a second newborn in the mix was not going to be conducive to traveling down to Atlanta. Luckily, maybe unluckily, here we are in a virtual format, and so we get to do this. I'm an Army officer now in the reserves after about 7 years on active duty. I serve as a JAG officer, so that's a military attorney. And I also write for and podcast for The Legal Geeks, which is a website that takes legal issues in pop culture and analyzes them through the lens of the law in order to teach certain basic principles of the law. We've been at San Diego Comic-Con where we've presented a mock court-martial of Poe Dameron. We just did for San Diego Comic-Con at home a panel on legal issues in kaiju movies, like, is it legal to put out a stay-at-home order when Godzilla is trampling through Tokyo, that sort of thing. But it's a lot of fun. My home and my heart is with DragonCon. If there were one convention and only one that I could go to every year, it would be DragonCon. The family there at the Star Wars track is just one that I've really latched onto, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and present with all of you today. So without further ado, let's dive just right into some controversy. We've seen a lot of Mandalorian culture, a lot of Mandalorian, an evolution of what we know to be the Mandalorians throughout Rebels, Clone Wars, some of the novels, both Legends and canon, and certainly with the show. But I have to ask the panel, and I'll start at the top with Brian, and we'll work through everybody. What's the deal with Boba Fett and Jango Fett now? Where do they fit into this big puzzle?
According to the canon currently, although it could always change because the canon's ever evolving, we're looking at them not being Mandalorians. In an episode of the Clone Wars, I believe in the second season, the Prime Minister of Mandalore sort of commented about how these were thugs that had no idea where they got the armor, but they didn't live to the tenets of the Mandalorians, and that they weren't Mandalorians, which came as a shock to quite a few Star Wars fans. And they've sort of, Star Wars has sort of doubled down on that in various source books and postings on the official website. So they're just some hired guns who stole some armor as far as we know.
Tom?
Yeah, I think everybody likes to, or all the old fans, I should say, likes to kind of think that, yeah, they're still Mandos, but it's been beaten over our heads here for the last maybe 2 or 3 years that they're definitely not Mandalorians. Now, I've heard a lot of different conspiracy theories, like why would Prime Minister Almec admit to Jango Fett being a Mandalorian when the warriors aren't even on the planet? Blah blah blah. I mean, there's a lot of different theories that fans like to have about it, but I think at the end of the day, that Lucasfilm said they're not Mandalorians, so until that changes, they're not Mandalorians.
Alexa, I'll go to you for your thoughts on it. Did you have any attachment to Jango or Boba Fett? Folks are sort of hot and cold on these characters. I don't find that there's any in between.
I run hot and cold. I don't have any particular attachment to them because we didn't get to know them in the movies, and also because they don't have any real agency in the movies outside of anything to do with the main characters. Boba, he just gets killed he just get eaten by a Sarlacc, and Jango his head chopped off by, I forget, was it Mace Windu or some Jedi?
That tees it up well for Kyle. Kyle, I have to ask you this question, and anybody else can feel free to chime in. There's a scene in, episode 4, I think, of The Mandalorian, where right at the tail end, the body of Fennec Shand, the the assassin, is laying there in the Dune Sea, and you hear some spurs walk up to her. Is this Boba Fett's possible return to the universe?
I mean, I definitely lean that way. That I don't think you would tease something like that without it being Boba Fett, because otherwise, I think it's just going to it's a tease almost to make people mad. So I don't see the reason we do that without leading to a really big payoff. So if it's not Boba, I think it would have to be some other huge surprise and character that Star Wars fans are clamoring to see, and I don't see it being Grand Admiral Thrawn or something like that popping up randomly that'd make people happy. So if I had to bet on it, I would assume it's gonna be a Boba.
Then do we get a showdown between and a standoff between real Mandalorian and quote unquote fake Mandalorian?
I think one thing to pay attention to is from the show The Mandalorian, right, where Din Djarin really talks about how being a Mandalorian is not necessarily a race, but it's a creed, and it's being part of this, being part of his group of Mandalorians that are observing the culture. And we haven't seen any of that from Boba Fett, right? Jango might have gone through some of that, but Boba Fett definitely didn't. He trained himself with the underworld. He trained himself with Aura Singh and sort of led that life through the dark times as just a hired gun, as far as we know, without the benefit of any of that culture. And so I think that you probably could make an argument that because we haven't seen Jango's past, that maybe he is. But I think we've seen enough of Boba's to know that looking at him compared to the foundlings in Mandalorian, he's probably not.
That's actually a really, really good segue, totally unplanned, but one that tees us up perfectly to get into the meat of this thing. And what I first want to touch on and throw to the panelists is the shaping of what we know as Mandalorians from, we'll call it the Canon Reset, but even before that, we'll talk a little bit about what we knew of Mandalorians in the EU and Legends up to the present. And I want to start, Tom, I'll toss this to you. But the Mandalorian was, and Clone Wars and Rebels and the Star Wars films were far from the only time that we saw Mandalorians depicted in the Star Wars universe. What can you tell us about where they've come from, where we saw them in the EU and in, now Legends material?
Sure. Mandalorians had huge parts in a lot of the old Legends comics. There were several Legends book series written about them. Karen Traviss would have been really the author that fleshed out the culture in the Legends material, a lot of which has really made it over still to the canon, the new canon material. But I think a lot of what we saw back in those Legends days, the adoption of war orphans, the fact that it's not necessarily humanity as a race, they come from an alien race of 8,000 years prior to where we are now. So I mean, it's there's a lot of diversity there from in the old Legends that's kind of working its way up. So I think the evolution, as far as that goes, is just basically taking some of those old stories and trying to transition them over to canon as best they can, without without retconning too much of the new stuff. But I think it's actually been a pretty smooth evolution. In fact, some of the newest stuff we see in the Mandalorian really makes me the most happy about where things are going. But as a warrior culture, it's pretty much stayed the same. As a diverse group of civilization, it's pretty much stayed the same. So the evolution's been super smooth.
I think that's a really important point, because this constant drumbeat that you hear from certain segments of the fandom is this sort of universal outcry about the departure, sometimes significant departure from stories that folks know and love. And it's good. Tom, I your perspective is a unique one here, given your long ties to the Mandalorian community on the fan side. But one of the best things that I think I've ever heard shared was Timothy Zahn's perspective on the transition, not specific to Mandalorians, but he's been asked the question, as I've been in the audience multiple times, about his feelings about this switch over and what material got left behind, what material got carried forward. And I think in the context of The Mandalorian, his answer was really applicable. And he said, these stories from the Legends period, EU period, whatever you want to call it, they're not gone. Nobody's taken them off the shelves. Nobody's taken them off your shelves or erased them. It's like the Legends of the Round Table, and sort of the evolution of storytelling throughout time. If you enjoy a story, if you enjoy that book that's on the shelf, there's nobody that can tell you that it's not valid and it's not real. And so it's good to know that there's a strong connective tissue with things that are being brought forward from Legends and EU in the current canon Mandalorian culture. But never let a label on a book dissuade you from enjoying something. I think that's the big takeaway with all of this when we talk evolution. Kyle, I want to throw this question to you. We saw a lot of the Mandalorians in the Clone Wars, from Satine Kryze to the new Mandalorians to Death Watch. What are your impressions, having watched the Clone Wars once upon a time, or maybe repeatedly now that it's on Disney Plus, and seeing how they're portrayed, how this society is portrayed in this show?
So I'll confess something. Up until this year, I'd never seen any of the animated series. It was a big hole in my Star Wars stuff. It just, when it first started coming out, I was busy with other stuff. And I just never got caught up. And it's one of those things, I fell a couple of seasons behind. How do I catch up? So one of the things I did this year during the pandemic, while I was working home for a while, was I binge watched all the animated series on Disney Plus. Thank the Lord for Disney Plus now. So the Clone Wars and Rebels and all that stuff is very fresh in my mind. And the Mandalorian stuff depicted throughout both those series were some of my favorite parts. And one of the things I enjoyed the most, coming from my background of studying political history, is I loved how Mandalore was depicted as having multiple viewpoints. Often in sci-fi, you have a society where like everybody's views is just uniform, very monolithic, where it's very much, there's no debate or there's no opposing factions. But the new Mandalorians, Death Watch, has seen how it evolves, and basically Death Watch accused the new Mandalorians of not being true Mandalorians, and seeing how just cultures can evolve and you can go in different directions, from the more conservative religious side to ones who want to take it in a more pacifist view. In a lot of ways, I think it's the most accurate depiction of a culture in sci-fi, because you do get these various viewpoints, which is what real culture's like. There's no country on the planet where everybody's 100% united behind one philosophy. There's always different viewpoints and stuff. So I really loved how it was depicted in the animated series, for sure.
And Alexa, if you've watched Rebels, I guess I should. What do you think about? We also saw a lot of the Mandalorians, in particular, Sabine Wren, who was a central character throughout the series. What were your takeaways? What were your thoughts about seeing this period of the Mandalorian sort of a lot closer in time to where the show is, and then watching the Mandalorian?
It was pretty jarring to see the Empire being allied with the faction the Mandalorians, and then hearing about the Empire turning on the Mandalorians. It was a little jarring. It's just like, how did the purge even happen? Was it like a Stalinist purge when they were just like, you're an enemy of the people or something like that? Or
I think a lot of that came out of Rebels, though, where you had the Imperial loyalists under Rook Cast and those sorts that were loyal to the Imperials, subverted and supplanted by Bo-Katan and Sabine Wren, and sort of allying themselves with the rebellion. So I think that paved the way pretty clearly for the Night of a Thousand Tears.
And I should say, I don't know if it'll pop up on the recording, but you guys, the way I have the little speaker screen, it looks like you guys it's your head and the body of Ursa Wren. So you're all honorary Mandalorians for the panel. It's been very distracting as you guys have been talking on this slide. So let's transition and talk about the actual Mandalorian Society. And we're fortunate to have the backdrop of what we've seen across canon and Legends material sort of be refined and expanded upon in this series. And I first want to go back and reuse the slide that we just saw. Where has Mandalorian Society come since we saw it more than a decade before, 2 decades before, at the start of the Clone Wars, when you've got this divergence between the new Mandalorians and the more militant Death Watch?
I think,
and Brian, I'll start with you.
I think one of the things we can look back is even a little bit further behind that, before Phantom Menace, with the stories of Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon talking about the initial sort of civil war that brought the pacifists led by Duchess Satine into power. And so it seems like Obi-Wan talks about in the Clone Wars how he spent a year there on the run trying to help protect Satine from these more violent elements that were trying to take over the government at the time when the pacifists were sort of coming into their own. And that conflict ended with Satine and the pacifists in power. And as we move forward through to the Clone Wars in that 10 or 15 years, I talked to Dave Filoni at one point when these episodes were first airing, and he talked about how this was really sort of like, imagine Germany in World War I, where the pacifists have taken over, but the more militant factions are upset about the way things went, and they start slowly trying to take that power back. And that's sort of what Death Watch is working on. It's sort of a powder keg to start the war.
Or Rome pre-Julius Caesar.
Yeah,
absolutely. And the thing that jumped into my head, and Kyle, I'll bring you on this one as well, is that shift in Mandalorian society almost, to me, evoked the post-World War II shift away from militancy and the Japanese culture. And we can, I think the discussion of how some of these things like Article 9 in the Japanese Constitution, or the Japanese Constitution as a whole, came to be is probably a separate discussion. But if you fast forward to today, you've got a constitutional rejection of offensive military force, of war, enshrined in the Japanese Constitution, and that is now a very, very popular tenet amongst Japanese people. If you were to look at any sort of public opinion polls, Japanese people are very strongly in favor of Article 9, very opposed to any sort of international military engagements. In fact, one of the only times that the Japanese military has been deployed overseas since World War II was for a reconstruction project, a limited deployment in Iraq in the 2000s. And that really evoked a lot of it for me. Kyle, what other connections did you see in real world history to this shift?
Well, definitely, which has already been brought up, Japan and Germany. I think you definitely saw that, Germany post-World War I, as you mentioned, Japan post-World War II, we had these cultures make this dramatic shift and pivot. I mean, you see it throughout American history as well, where we go through periods of, do we intervene, do we not intervene, in various societies to debate around that. I mean, another great example is Scandinavia. And Sweden was a very imperialistic military for a long time and dominated huge parts of Central and Eastern Europe. And now Scandinavia is perhaps one of the more peace-loving parts of the world. And the idea of Sweden invading Germany and Russia would almost seem implausible that their society would want to do that. I like to think that the Japanese example might be the best, because it is a society that made a very quick pivot. It wasn't something that developed over a few hundred years. It was World War II, and then it happens instantly. And with the new Mandalorians, you do seem to have that happen after a civil war. You instantly pivot to this very pacifist society. That's not an easy thing to accomplish. And I think the Clone Wars does show that it's a hard struggle for a society to make that type of change and not be toppled by the ones they're opposing for that, which in some ways is remarkable that Japan has been able to make that transition so successfully that now, if you ask somebody that had no knowledge of World War II and like, here's today's Asian cultures, pick which Asian country was helped start World War II, some people would never guess Japan. You would just seem like, oh, they probably never fought a war. They're like Switzerland or something like that. But that's not the case. So it's a very interesting cultural shift for sure.
Alexi, you brought up the Roman Republic, and I want to ask your take, because the where we see Mandalorians in the show is very, very different from where we see them in Clone Wars or certainly in Rebels. I mean, this is a broken society. What did you think about seeing that evolution? Because it was sort of a hard turn from the last time that we saw them on screen.
It mimics the Roman Republic in that there was a civil war, and that there was a populist faction, a war-making faction called the Populares, led by Julius Caesar and Crassus and Pompey. There's a triumvirate. And there was another faction that was more pacifist, that his name escapes me, not the Populares, I forgot the name of the other faction. It is a pacifist faction, definitely. Anti-expansion.
Sounds a lot like Clan Ren versus the Super Commandos, Gar Saxon, Tiber Saxon, sort
Absolutely.
of the seeds that were planted there at the end of Rebels. And so I think we're on the verge of hopefully learning a little bit more about that, whether it's through
And
season
Tiber
2.
is the name of the river that runs through Rome.
I don't think that was any accident how he was named. So let's dive more into the actual culture and in particular the creed that we see in season 1. And I want to start with the phrase that's now become, I think it's other than "May the Force be with you," become the phrase that's most quickly picked up by Star Wars fans. This is the way, seen and heard very early on in the show. It's etched in all our hearts. Brian, what is this sort of creed? What does it mean for the Mandalorian Society?
So I think it means a lot of things, but I think we're still sort of discovering what it is, right? I think that the differences between the Mandalorian Society that Din Djarin in the Mandalorian show is exhibited is something drastically different than we've seen on Rebels or on Clone Wars. And it's interesting that the Mandalorian actually goes all the way through Clone Wars. And I'm wondering if this is the way it has a lot to do with the foundling aspect of the culture, where because Din is found during a Clone Wars engagement by Death Watch or Death Watch commandos, and they talk about how he's never taken his helmet off, but we see Death Watch during the Clone Wars taking off their helmets all the time, and other Mandalorians with Clan Ren and all the other clans, they take their helmets off all the time as well. And this seems rooted in maybe like an older, deeper, more I don't want to say spiritual, but a more rigid orthodoxy of Mandalorian culture that we haven't seen before. And I know some people are sort of concerned that, like, well, this doesn't match Rebels and it doesn't match Clone Wars. I think it does. I think we're just seeing, again, like we talked about earlier, a different aspect of it, because we're seeing so many different aspects of the culture, right? Like the pacifist Mandos led by Duchess Satine didn't even wear any of the armor. They had some of the design elements from the armor in their fabric clothing. Death Watch definitely had different design tastes than others, and I think we're just seeing a new version of it. And I think that creed, this is the way, is rooted in that, as opposed to maybe something you'd see on all over Mandalore.
Tom, what do you think about the sort of non-uniformity in Mandalorian culture that's highlighted by a creed like this?
Sure. Well, I think going back to something Brian said, I think this is actually very spiritual. I mean, you've got in episode 2 where Din says that weapons are part of his religion. So I mean, he even acknowledges the spiritual context of what the creed means. I think a lot of the of the differences in how we see Mandos is really dependent on what part of that creed maybe that you believe in, or um, maybe just a whole different vein of the religious spiritual portion of this. You know, every clan is probably going to have something that's different between each other. Just like you see Clan Ren, you see Clan Saxon, you see the Mandalorian protectors. All of them have something different about them, and they have different colors. They have different sigils, what do they call it when they put signet. They have something different about them, and I think that is one of the sort of the core things that make Mandalorians so attractive to people as from a fan standpoint, is that of those differences and the fact that you can still be a Mandalorian and have those differences in universe. So I mean, I don't necessarily think that either way is one way is wrong from the other. It's just what part of the Mandalorian ethos are you are do you align yourself with? And I think that's a lot of what the whole "this is the way" is. It's sort of like some of the there's fraternal organizations out there that have similar sayings. So I mean, I think it's very much along those same lines. It's just what part of the spirituality you know is that specific Mandalorian following.
It says something about the power of this show that even these gifs or gifs, depending on how you say it, just make me want to abandon all of you and go watch the show. I'll just be in the background with it playing. Kyle, I want to talk to you. Tom and Brian both brought up good points that sort of touch on some real world connections here, and this aspect and vein of religion that flows through the Mandalorian Society. What can you tell us about some of the reflections or maybe some of the areas that the Mandalorian seems to have drawn on or parallel in our own history?
Yeah, well, the one thing that came to mind, especially in the Mandalorian, the show, is the foundling aspect of it. In fact, he's a new member. In fact, one thing I'm very curious with that group is how many of them are foundlings. And one reason I'm kind of curious about that is a lot of times throughout human history, especially with religious orders, converts tend to take even more extreme views within the religion, almost to prove like I'm really a believer now. I'm whatever I was before, I'm fully in. They're so obsessed with the idea of being accused of not being a true believer that they become more hardcore than the people that have grown up in that religion. So like you see that a lot, and obviously this Mandalorian culture and the way they use religion definitely focuses more on a military wing. So as the images you have up, the Crusades definitely is a great example of that. But that's just one throughout religious groups that definitely use their religion to kind of build the perfect soldier in a lot of ways. Anything from even the English Civil War and stuff like that, where you have a religion you don't normally think of being war making, that for that period became a model army built on the Protestant church and stuff like that.
And Alexa, I want to put to you, and I don't mean this to be too obvious a question, but how common is it throughout our own history to have an organization, a sect, resort to violence over religious beliefs?
Very common.
Yeah, I think we see that throughout history, and
The
folks
Crusades, the Reconquista.
And I don't necessarily think that the Mandalorians, wage any sort of war to convert anyone. I don't think we'd have a lot of evidence like that. These aren't the Crusaders that are going out and trying to change the galaxy to be, a unified Mandalorian kingdom. If anything, they're trying to stay insulated.
Well, no, I think we do have some evidence of that. If you go back and look at like the deep Mandalorian history that got told as far as Tara Vizsla and the first Mandalorian Jedi and whatnot, part of the reason, or even with Kanan kind of telling those stories, the Mandalorians were conquerors, and they were going out and conquering to bring people into their fold. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of like Napoleon's conquering, right? Where it's like, I'm going to bring my brand of democracy to you. And that's when they first came in contact with the Jedi, and that's when they started building their weapons and building all of everything that makes a Mando was designed specifically to combat the Jedi because of those ancient conflicts. And that's why it was such a big deal that Tar Vizsla was chosen by the Jedi and brought to the temple and became the first Mando Jedi, and then built his Darksaber, and that became a huge thing for the Mandalorians as well. But I do see their at least distant past as those conquerors going out and just taking over world after world after world.
And we see that in the old legends as well. I mean, that was, they spent almost 1,000 years as just conquerors between the Crusaders and Neo Crusaders. It wasn't uncommon for Mandalorians to be known as conquerors.
We see other aspects, and the group collectively has brought these up before now, but two of the most powerful that stood out to me were first and foremost Din's refusal, his adherence to this idea that he will not take off his helmet for any living being. And then secondly, and maybe a little more humorously, the part where he refuses to put down his weapons for the Jawa negotiation, which may have been one of my top 5 all-time favorite Star Wars moments. Tom, what can we say about sort of these core tenets? I don't recall. I mean, we've certainly touched on this business of other aspects of Mandalorian culture not seeming to reflect the helmet idea. What's your take on that aspect of?
Sure. I mean, I think there was the line that the armor said during the whole helmet, the Paz Vizsla Din helmet fighting scene where she says, when you walk the path of the Mandalore, you are both hunter and prey. And I think that is, that is a great, I mean, that could almost be taken as some sort of Mando Bible verse, if you will. It's, I think that, they've got, at least these Mandos specifically, they have these tenets, this list of things. Back in the Legends days, we would have called it the Resolnair, which was basically the tenets that Karen Travis wrote for Mandalorians back then. And then before that, you had the Canons of Honor, and you had Jaster Muriel's Codex. You had several different levels of these tenets that have been talked about since Legends material. So it was that this is something that has absolutely been brought over to canon. But it's what they live by. I mean, it's it's the things that guide them as warriors, as this warrior society, and I think based off what we've seen so far in the Mandalorian, so far this specific sect is very adherent to these tenets. So one of the things that interests me is if we see some Mandalorians who are left over from Mandalore, and what tenets do they follow? Because we don't hear about any of that in Clone Wars or Rebels. They don't talk about tenets really in there. So I think that's one thing that really interests me is where's the divergence in those tenets.
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful aspects of it that stood out to me in Rebels certainly was this reverence for the Darksaber, for that symbolic representation of their culture and the passage of power in their culture. One of the most powerful episodes of Rebels was the one where Sabine squares off against Kanan training on the Darksaber. And there's just this incredible energy to the scene. There's this reverence as she and he square off, and you see some of those old flames come out, even though she didn't fight obviously any of the ancient wars that Brian brought up, that sort of simmering cultural antipathy comes out, and I love that we've seen that carried forward. And Tom, you bring up a really good point about warrior cultures, warrior-centric cultures, and I want to ask Kyle. Certainly, there have been a number of, I would loosely quote them as warrior-centric cultures. What can we look to in history that is a reflection of what we see in the Mandalorian culture from that aspect?
Well, I think as way is depicted in the show, probably the group it reminds me the most of is the Spartan culture, where it's just so much built around war and that martial sense of the society, and how it's in some ways very insulated, very mysterious. Outside groups have a hard time understanding their extreme measures they'll go. I know I've recently read a book about ancient Greece, and that's one thing they always talk about. The other city-states were utterly befuddled by Spartan culture. They could just never figure it out. And it's the same way you see on the show, where you have that conversation with Cara Dune, where she's completely surprised that she finds out he can just take the helmet off and there's no punishment. You just can't be part of the group anymore. Oh, well, just take the helmet off. What's the big deal? And I could easily have seen that same type of conversations happening between somebody living in ancient Athens and Sparta as they talk about it. It's like, why don't you do that? And the person from Athens being utterly befuddled by what the person from Sparta says when they explain the links they took their culture, how they stress making the perfect warrior in a lot of ways.
I think there's a lot of sort of Bushido and samurai culture in it too, so much, especially when you've got Din Djarin is essentially sort of a Ronin in some ways, and has sort of lost his way and his master in a way, I guess. But you've also got the idea that Mandalorians are very inspired by Clint Eastwood and his spaghetti western movies, which were literally direct remakes of samurai movies, right? So you can trace Jeremy Bulloch, although we know Boba Fett's not a Mandalorian, his performance and all of the stuff that they did with Boba Fett, right down to the sound of the spurs on his armor, came from Clint Eastwood and A Fistful of Dollars, which was in turn a shot-for-shot remake of Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo, which was about a Ronin who just goes in and is all about getting paid from everyone while turning all of the bad guys against each other. And that's something Din Djarin's very, very good at. But I think that samurai culture, that Bushido code, is something that permeates it at every level of all of the Mandalorians that we've seen, even in small ways. Even the pacifists, sort of, you get the idea that they interpret that code to say, like, hey, we need to be pacifists rather than warriors. And Death Watch interprets that a different way, and the covert that Din Djarin is with interprets it a different way again.
Brian, yet again, you bring up a very good segue to lead us into talking about this clan structure, something that we uniquely saw here. We certainly saw the divisions of Mandalorian families, for lack of a better term, into clans in both Rebels and Clone Wars. But here we see it in a unique light, to say the least. And Brian, since you were the last to tee this one up, I'll put it to you. What is, how do Mandalorian clans work that we know? What is this covert that we see in the show?
So I think the way we've seen Mandalorian clans work as far as Clone Wars and Rebels is that they're these great houses, very much like you'd see the clans led by daimyos competing to be shogun of Japan in this feudal society. Mandalore is very much the same way. And Tom, please correct me if something sounds fishy as I'm talking about this. But so you have those people, these heads of these households competing for this, and there's someone who sort of unites them overall. And sometimes they're leaderless, or sometimes they've got a pacifist for a leader, or they end up with Maul. But I think the covert works a little differently. I get the impression the covert works differently. in that they're an assemblage of people who aren't necessarily part of the same houses or families, or maybe they're sorts of orphans, not just orphans from their circumstances like Din Djarin is, but maybe from their houses or their clans. Paz Vizsla, voiced by Jon Favreau on The Mandalorian, is another one of those where it's like, have the Vizslas completely lost their standing after the Night of a Thousand Tears? And you know, how does that work? Are they just sort of this mishmash, and that's why they are the way they are, as opposed to the houses and the clans that we'd seen before? And I think one of the big questions is did the Purge sort of end that, so that this is a result of that?
Yeah, I think Brian's got most of that right. You know, when you look at how the hierarchy worked on Mandalore proper, or I'll just say in Mandalorian space, because you've got Clan Ren on Cronus, you got Concord Dawn. It was, you know, it was very sort of feudalish, where you had houses and you had clans under houses, and the houses were kind of the, you know, the major ruling parties, and people, you know, people were vying for alliances here, and it was very Game of Thrones-ish, I'm sure. But you know, as we've transitioned now to this post, you know, Mandalorian excision, whatever you want to call it, I think everybody's just, you know, they're on the brink. They don't really care so much about the old alliances. They just want to keep the culture and the creed going. So, you know, things like, you know, whose family was against who or whose family was for who, it didn't really matter. I mean, you know, yeah, you've got Paz Vizsla here, who may be the only, him and the armorer, as far as we know, may be the only actual blood Mandalorians in the covert, and they may be the ones who are passing down the traditions to the foundlings. You know, the armor, I would say, takes this position pretty much chiefly as the person who is, you know, dispensing the tradition to all the newcomers and really teaching them how to be a Mandalorian. So, you know, there is no Royal Academy of Mandalore like there was during the Clone Wars. Now there's just the traditions.
And what's phenomenal is clearly there's been a seismic shift in at least this segment of the Mandalorian culture post Purge, and in spite of that, as Tom, you put it, teetering on the edge, they still adhere to those core tenets. The standoff between Paz and Din there in the covert, where the armor intervenes and sort of lays out some of their core tenets, and it's just a really powerful moment because everybody stops. I mean, you think you're about to see some blood get spilled, Mando on Mando crime, and all of a sudden she sort of reels them in and reminds them of what they're there for and why they sort of exist. And they immediately back off. And, you know, we'll get into this in a bit, but even though Din has to some extent strayed from whatever path he was on pre-purge or pre-collapse of the Empire, he still adheres. There's a strong bond to those core tenets of their society, and that's one of the most fascinating aspects of the show for me. Alexa, I want to put to you, and this may be a little bit of a tough question because it's almost pure speculation. Who is the armorer? Who's Paz? What's their role here? How do they fit into the covert, the clan? What'd you think?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know who they. I mean, Paz. He's a Vizsla, so he might have those connections to Death Watch.
There were rumbling rumors, and Brian, Tom, Kyle, feel free to step in, that the armorer could be Ursa Wren, Sabine's mother from Rebels. I don't know whether
I've heard that. I've heard it could be Rook Cast, since we see her fly off at the end of Clone Wars there without Maul.
I think I think if it were Rook cast, though, they would have had the voices match, and they would have either brought
Sure.
Vanessa Marshall in to voice her on the show, on the live action show, or bring the person who did the voice over to this latest season of Clone Wars. They're really good about matching those voices, which is the only torpedo I can find for that theory. But otherwise, I like it. As far as who they could be, I think I would not be surprised if the armor was a new character either. And part of that is because this covert, like this group that Din Djarin's been part of, has been around in one way or another since the Clone Wars, and there's not a lot of characters that we saw that were off the map enough to be nurturing Din in this way on any of the shows so far. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was a completely new character.
Quite frankly, I hope that's what it is. While I like connective tissue, there gets to be a point where solid connections like that, or just roping in characters that we've known and loved from other shows, gets to be restrictive from a storytelling standpoint. And I think
I agree.
The great thing about Mandalorian, and hopefully you'll agree with this as well, Alex, is that it showed the power of the power of fans to be able to attach to brand new characters. You know, we don't know anything about their backgrounds. Nobody didn't like Din Djarin because he hasn't been seen before. Everybody seemed to glob onto him and the child as well.
Yeah.
So I hope that's the case for these two. Go ahead.
I was saying I agreed.
So, Alexa, I'm going to keep you on the hot seat because my next question for you, and one that I meant to add on to the last question about the armor, is her role within the covert, and more broadly, the role of females in the Mandalorian Society, and your take on that, especially as it pertains to what we've seen throughout history.
It's a very matriarchal society, or at least matrilineal, that is as inspired by the ancient Egyptians, who gave women a lot of power. They had female rulers, female pharaohs, not just Cleopatra. They had a female pharaoh called Hatshepsut. They also had two other female pharaohs. The Venus figurines on the right, you can see on the right with the stone figurine. Those were either goddesses or something like that, and they were often found in Ice Age burials, which points to a Neolithic great goddess. And the Viking shield maidens, they went into combat with the men, just as the Mandalorian women go into combat with the men.
I really loved Ursa Wren and her relationship with her husband, actually, and the way she was very much in charge of the family, and Sabine's father was just the artist. That was really very pleasing to me.
Kind of like the Vikings, how the women were dominant, how women ran the household, and also they held the keys to the household, so nobody came in or out without their say-so.
There's an old Mandalorian proverb that says train your sons to be strong and your daughters to be stronger. So I think that kind of encapsulates the whole that encapsulates all of it right there, in my opinion. I mean, it's gender was never, there was never a gender inequality in Mandalorians that we've known of. They all fight, they're warriors. There's no, it's not so much you're a warrior here, a warrior here, you're a warrior. If you wear the armor, you speak the language, you're the warrior. So
one thing I was really impressed when I was watching the Clone Wars is that, unless I missed it, Death Watch never accused the new Mandalorians of being pacifist because their leader was a female. But that was not part of it. It's just that's the way that group would win. It wasn't because the Duchess was in charge. It was never about, the man should be in charge. It's just more they had different philosophies. It wasn't built on that. And I was very impressed they took that viewpoint, where it had been very easily to say, like, oh, you're only pacifist because there's a Duchess in charge. You need a real Mandalorian man to be in charge. And I was very happy they didn't go that route.
And you see, that's a great point, Kyle, because you see several standoffs throughout Clone Wars and Rebels between a male and a female Mandalorian. The best one, in my opinion, is Sabine facing off against Gar Saxon right there at the Wren homestead. There's no statement by Gar that she's somehow not his equal or anything like that. Even you rewind a little earlier in the series when Fen Rao faces off against Sabine. There's no vein of sexism there. It's just warrior on warrior, and may the best warrior win.
We even later in the series, just being where basically the new leader, I just forgot his name, basically acknowledges she's smarter and she's the only person that can understand this new weapon that she's created. So yeah, it's very much built more on talent and skill versus your sex.
And certainly go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, I really like how the culture seems to be like, and this is a really weird analogy and from the wrong universe, but in Star Trek, everybody's an engineer at a base level, even if they're doctors, security, this or that, everybody has that grounding. Mandalorian culture has that for being warriors. Like, that's the baseline of their culture for everyone, and I find that really, really interesting, regardless of gender or profession or anything.
This got brought up earlier, but now we can sort of sink our teeth into it because the foundlings play a key role. I think one of the central themes for Din's character is his upbringing, his rescue and then upbringing as a foundling. And Brian, I'll start with you. What role do they play? What role do these children play in this society, in the covert that we see in the show?
So it seems like, again, it's talked about so vaguely that we're not quite sure, but what I can discern is that this is a way, the Mandalorians are the heroes of their own story. And as the Mandalorians were on that planet there where they found Din, and rescued him from the Clone Wars conflict, from the Separatist invasion, he was an innocent, and they brought him in and they trained him. And so this is a way to bolster their numbers and bring people in to the fold without necessarily having worthless mouths to feed, right? Like they bring them in and they train them. And Din, it seems like, feels very, he's very concerned about the plight of those sort of foundling orphans, which is why he gives so much of the Beskar that he wins to that cause. And that's why ultimately I think he wants to take the child back to his people, because he's very much, he identifies in that. And the purpose of them, I'm not quite sure we've discerned yet, but I think the reasoning behind them is very much that the Mandalorians are, for all their warlike ways, compassionate, especially toward kids.
And this is not really a new idea either, about Mandalorians adopting the war orphans, so to speak. And that's another thing that was brought up. In fact, that was really the last thing that I was waiting on to be brought back from Legends. It really was the biggest thing. That and alternate species being Mandalorians. Those are like the two big things that are left, really. And they brought the war orphans back. So now I'm just waiting on the non-human Mandalorians to show up. But I mean, I think it's really powerful because it says a lot about a civilization that will go in and they'll fight, and then they won't just sit there and slaughter everybody. They'll take in the children, and they will show some compassion to those children, and they'll train them to sort of not just fend for themselves, but to also further on the ethos. So.
And by train, you mean train in exploding rockets and jetpacks.
Exactly. I mean, what kid wouldn't want to have their own exploding rocket and jetpack and flamethrower?
Yeah.
Come on.
I would very much like a remake of Leon the Professional, but with just
Din and the child.
Yeah.
Like Baby Yoda screwing on a silencer to a blaster.
Yeah.
I got a little bit of a vibe of the Clive Owen movie Children of Men, and not that that movie's about mass infertility is spread and there's a finally a child that's born toward the end of the movie, and sort of the society latches onto the hope. But sort of there was an echo of that movie, I think, in this almost religious treatment of children amongst the Mandalorian people. And I think we've talked about before this near collapse of their society. This is the literal future, whether it's an adopted child that was rescued from some horrible situation, or a child born of the covert, from Mandalorians that are part of a clan. They are literally the last, the last best hope. And I think there's a powerful motivation in Din, not just in that he draws from his own history, but he sees sort of through clear lenses exactly what is needed for this covert to survive. He's not the future of his clan or the Mandalorian people as a whole. It's the little ones. And I think that's what's probably the most powerful narrative driver of this entire series, and that obligation that he feels to the child. And there's one of my favorite scenes in the entire show is in the last episode when the armorer implores upon him or reminds him of his obligation. He's now, the legal term would be in loco parentis, but he is the father to the child until he completes his obligation, which is either returning him to his kind or raising him to adulthood. And that's a really solemn vow. It's not something that he clearly takes lightly. And I absolutely love that aspect of the Mandalorian culture here.
Foundlings are the future.
They are. This is the way. Brian, I put this slide in here especially for you. You've already touched on it a little bit, but you have, amongst all of us, the deepest knowledge of film here. Can you tell us a little bit about where the sort of cultural inspirations through film that the Mandalorian draws from?
So the two pictures you have up here from slides from, I believe that's Yojimbo and Lone Wolf and Cub, which was a series of 6 films based on a manga in Japan. And they were sort of really cool 70s Japanese Jedi Geki films, but also like that gritty 70s exploitation film as well. And Lone Wolf and Cub tells the story about the shogun's executioner who's betrayed by a different clan and has to sort of go into exile and then plot his revenge, and has to take his son with him because they've killed his wife. And so his very young son is sort of given the option in a very tense scene in the first film, Lone Wolf and Cub Sword of Vengeance. He gives the child Daigoro a choice between he shows him a ball and a sword, and he lets the 2-year-old crawl to whichever one and says, if it's the ball, you're going to join your mother in the afterlife, and if you take the sword, you're going to learn the way of the assassin with me. And so that imagery from Lone Wolf and Cub of the master swordsman and the master assassin pushing a baby carriage with a child in it is part and parcel, like, I think the aesthetic that they were going for. Absolutely. If you look at all the art, the key art, and even the key images from the show, is there really anything cooler than the Mandalorian walking around with the child in its little carriage? And so these were definite keys to that. And I think, they're just both great movies. I would recommend that for a better understanding of Mando culture and Star Wars and film history, I would highly recommend both Yojimbo and Lone Wolf and Cub Sword of Vengeance.
Giving a slide like this to Brian is like letting a dove out of a cage to just fly free. I had to put it in there.
I appreciate it. It's always good to get my moment.
Yeah. So what I want to end with before we do sort of a final wrap up is just around the horn, sort of impressions of where Mandalorians have come to in terms of their depiction and their connection to other societies, other cultures that we've seen on and off screen in Star Wars canon. Where do you feel is the strongest connection? I've got just a few up here. Brian, I'll start with you.
I think one of the strongest connections is their contrast to the Jedi, right? Where their culture, like we said earlier, their weapons, their armor, it's all built to combat the Jedi. And it's sort of like that evolution where these are our natural enemies and we need to build all of these abilities on ourselves because we don't have that access to the Force. And I think that when you look at Mandalorian culture and you look at Jedi culture through the history, they're opposites to create equals, right? Where they're trying to match each other, or at least the Mandalorians are trying to match the Jedi. And I find that very interesting. And that was also why I found it so sort of shocking that Din had never really heard of Jedi, especially as a kid growing up in the Clone Wars and having witnessed battles with separatists, that he'd never heard of a Jedi really before was sort of shocking, especially since fighting the Jedi so ingrained in Mandalorian culture.
Tom, what about you?
I think Brian kind of crushed it for me there. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Brian completely on this. I mean, they are kind of set up to be, I don't want to say a Jedi foil, but they are, set up to be sort of adversarial to Jedi without the Force. And I think that's important, at least in Star Wars, because not everything can, and this is more of a personal feeling here, I don't think everything should necessarily revolve around who can and can't use the Force. There should be some sort of great equalizer out there, and I think Mandalorians kind of fill that role as sort of the great filter beyond just Jedi and Sith, and they're kind of the third blade, so I totally agree with what Brian says.
Alexa, how about you?
They just took my words. I don't have much to say on this.
That's all right. Jedi's a very good comparison, and Brian put
It
it
is
very
a pretty good comparison.
Yeah. Kyle, how about you?
Well, I agree on the Jedi stuff. I'll also touch on the Chiss for sure. I think you see certain elements of that. One is both are very mysterious cultures that other cultures in Star Wars universe both seem to be kind of mystified by. The Chiss, the way they're depicted, are always very centered around military prowess, much like the Mandalorians. All the Chiss tend to operate as more traditional armies versus the Mandalorians more unconventional warfare. And then at least in a lot of the Thrawn books, you see that tension in Chiss culture where Thrawn represents one side that believes in intervention to help save the Chiss, and the other side are very strictly, we're pro-military, but we only attack if we're attacked first. And you have that tension, and a little, different debate, but similar to the new Mandalorians and Death Watch, where you do have these different viewpoints of how the culture should go, but at the same time, both are kind of embracing that they are a warrior spirit. So it's not a perfect comparison, but I definitely think I think Thrawn would feel very at home with the Mandalorian, which I think is why, at least in Rebels, he was so fascinated by a lot of the artwork of Sabine that, I think he could connect to that Mandalorian culture very easily.
When there's that good connection between the use of child soldiers between the two, but I won't get into that. I will briefly say that I like the parallels to the Night Sisters and Mother Talzin at the head, that the group from the Clone Wars that we see pretty extensively. There are obvious differences in the two cultures, but at the core, you have a very tight-knit group of sisters, as far as the Night Sisters go. They're bonded by blood, in a sense. They're bonded by a virtual religious adherence to magics, and sort of a powerful leader in Mother Talzin and Mother Daka. They have a very strong sense of bondage to their ancestral roots, and I think you see that depicted in a great way in the Jedi Fallen Order game, when you get to go around and get killed repeatedly on Dathomir. But those roots run deep, and I especially like the comparison between the Night Sisters as we see them toward the end of the Clone Wars, and even in the Jedi Fallen Order game, and the Mandalorians as they exist in the show, because you've got two cultures that have been wiped virtually to the brink at a certain point, and obviously the Night Sisters take a much harder fall at the end of the day, thanks to Grievous and the rest of the Separatists. But there's this circling of the wagons and this continued loyalty to their core tenets that you see exhibited through Asajj and some of the other characters.
The fact that they're both matriarchal.
Absolutely.
I think it's interesting too how their societies intertwined by the end, especially after Maul's capture in the comic book, the last canon Dark Horse comic book, Maul, Son of Dathomir, where their fates are sort of interlinked with Maul's fate, the Death Watch loyalists that are loyal to him, and Mother Talzin working on her resurrection. That they're all sort of seeing that writing on the wall and coming together in really interesting ways. Absolutely. And then it pays off so sweetly for Gar Saxon and the rest of them when Maul just sits there and says, nope, bye-bye, thank you for your help, and then abandons them right before he gets captured. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. This has been a really, really great discussion. I really genuinely appreciate our four panelists here. For those who are watching, you have no idea how quickly this panel came together. That was in no small part because of the hard work on the part of all of our panelists in chipping in, getting together rapidly an outline, helping get this presentation shaped up, and then making time, most importantly, to do this. Everybody's got busy schedules and everything is haywire in the world of COVID right now. But I hope that you all have enjoyed watching. Please reach out to us on social media, connect with each of us. I think I can speak on behalf of the group in saying that we would love to talk to all of you, even though we can't do that sort of great Q&A that always exists in 706. We'd love to have that experience online in the virtual world, so to speak. So thank you very much.